The forest was silent, too silent. David walked slowly, his boots pressing against the soft ground. The trees around him were tall and strange, their branches glowing faintly with green light. He had traveled far from the human colony, searching for rare minerals, but now he felt something else pulling him forward. Something was watching. He stopped listening. The air was thick with mist, and every sound seemed to echo. Then he heard it, a soft cry, like a child's voice, weak and trembling. David frowned, his heart beating faster. There should not be any children here, not in this dangerous part of the alien world. He followed the sound, pushing past vines that glowed in the dark. The crying grew louder, and soon he reached a clearing. There, under a broken pillar of stone, sat a small figure. It was not human. The child's skin was pale silver, eyes glowing softly like stars, and strange markings ran across its arms. Its clothes were torn, and it shivered as if lost and afraid. David froze, unsure of what to do. He had seen alien creatures before, but never a child. The child looked at him, wide-eyed, and whispered something in a language he could not understand. Still, he understood the fear, the loneliness. Slowly, he lowered his weapon and held out his hand. "It's all right," he said softly, though he knew the child could not understand his words. The alien child blinked, then reached out a trembling hand. When their fingers touched, David felt a strange warmth travel through him, as if the forest itself was watching, judging. He shivered, but he did not pull away. The child clung to him, and David picked it up carefully. It was lighter than he expected, fragile like glass. He looked around, searching for whoever this child belonged to, but the clearing was empty. Only the glowing vines and silent mist surrounded them. Something moved in the shadows. David turned quickly, but saw nothing. Still, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. The forest was alive with whispers, though no mouth spoke. Somewhere, far beyond the trees, a drum-like sound echoed once, then vanished. David's instincts told him to leave quickly. Holding the child close, he began walking back toward the valley. The child buried its face in his chest, trembling. He whispered calming words, even though he knew they meant nothing to the alien. But somehow, the child's breathing slowed, as if comforted. As he moved, the path seemed to change. Trees shifted, vines twisted, and symbols carved in stone flickered with light. It was as if the world itself was guiding him. David felt uneasy, yet he pressed on. He had promised himself long ago that he would never abandon the helpless, no matter the cost. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time felt strange here. At last, the forest opened, revealing the outline of a hidden village. Strange huts stood in circles, glowing crystals marking their paths. Figures emerged, tall aliens with markings across their faces and arms, their eyes sharp and unblinking. They saw David holding the child, and the air grew heavy. Not one of them moved to take the child. They only stared, their expressions unreadable. David raised his hand slightly, trying to show peace. "I found this little one," he said slowly, though he knew they could not understand. The aliens whispered among themselves, their voices low and filled with tension. Finally, an elder stepped forward, his staff glowing with symbols. He looked at David, then at the child in his arms. The elder's eyes widened, and he spoke a single word that echoed through the air. The crowd fell silent at once, as if the word carried power. David did not know what it meant, but he felt a chill. The child reached for the elder, but did not let go of David's arm. The elder nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving David's face. Something passed between them, something heavy and unseen. David felt as if a great weight had been placed upon his shoulders, though no one had explained why. The aliens bowed their heads slightly, not to the elder, but to David. He frowned, confused. "I just returned a child," he whispered to himself. But in the silence of that strange village, he heard whispers again, voices carried by the wind. And though he could not understand the language, one message became clear. He had been chosen. The village stood under the shadow of tall, glowing trees, its huts shaped from stone and crystal, every path marked by faint blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. David stepped carefully, the alien child still clinging to him. Dozens of eyes followed his every move, silent, watchful, filled with something he could not name. It was not simple fear, nor simple curiosity. It was something heavier, something deeper. He had expected the villagers to rush forward, to cry out for their missing child, to thank him for bringing the little one home. But no one moved, no one reached out. They only stood in their circles, staring as if he carried not a child, but a weapon, or perhaps a key to something forgotten. The elder with the glowing staff walked ahead slowly, his robes dragging against the dust. He raised one hand, and the crowd stepped back at once, leaving a clear path through the center of the village. David followed, his heart heavy with unease. Every step echoed too loudly, as though the very ground wanted to remember where he had walked. The child whispered something softly, a word David could not understand. Its voice was small, yet it seemed to calm the tension around them. Some villagers lowered their heads. Others pressed their hands against their chests in a strange gesture. It was clear to David that the child was more important than he had ever guessed. At the center of the village stood a great stone platform, carved with spirals and runes that glowed faintly. The elder stopped there, turning to face him. He spoke in his own tongue, his voice low but commanding. The words meant nothing to David, yet the tone felt like a judgment, a question, and a warning all at once. David shook his head slowly. "I don't understand you," he said, keeping his voice calm. The elder studied him in silence, his eyes sharp and ancient. Then he tapped his staff against the stone, and the runes lit brighter, sending waves of light across the platform. The crowd gasped softly, but no one moved closer. David felt the child tighten its grip on his arm, almost afraid of the light. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and endless. Even the air felt thick, as though the village itself was holding its breath. David wanted to set the child down, but each time he tried, the little one clung harder, refusing to let go. He sighed, shifting the child gently in his arms. "All right, I've got you," he whispered, even though he doubted the words carried any meaning here. The elder lifted his staff again, this time pointing at the child. The markings on the elder's skin glowed faintly, mirroring the runes on the stone. The villagers whispered, their voices 1,000 soft rivers flowing together. David could not make out the words, but he felt the weight of them. It was as though they were chanting, not in worship, but in expectation. Finally, the elder's eyes met David's again, and for a moment, David felt something sharp pierce his mind. A vision flickered, flashes of fire, shadows of warriors kneeling, a crown made not of metal, but of light. He staggered back, clutching his head, but the image vanished as quickly as it came. The villagers grew even quieter, their whispers fading to nothing. The child looked up at him then, its glowing eyes wide and steady. It placed its tiny silver hand against his chest, right over his heart. A warmth spread through him, strange and heavy. David's breath caught in his throat, and the villagers gasped again. The elder lowered his staff slowly, nodding as though some unseen answer had been given. David shook his head, confused. "I don't know what's going on here," he muttered under his breath. But no one explained. No one spoke to him directly. They only watched, silent as stone, their eyes filled with something between hope and fear. As the sun, or what passed for a sun on this world, dipped behind the glowing trees, shadows stretched long across the ground. Drums began to sound in the distance, deep and slow, echoing through the forest like the heartbeat of the world itself. The elder raised his staff once more, and the villagers bowed their heads in unison. David stood alone in the center, the child in his arms, wondering why he felt like a prisoner and a guest at the same time. The silence broke not with words, but with the sound of a single voice carried by the wind. It was not human, not alien, but something older, something that seemed to come from the stones themselves. David froze, his skin crawling as the voice whispered through the night. The villagers dropped to their knees, and the child held him tighter. He realized then that he had not just returned a lost child. He had walked into something ancient, something dangerous, and something that would not let him go. The drums grew louder through the night, slow and heavy, echoing across the silent village like the sound of a giant's heart. David stood on the stone platform, the alien child still clinging to him. The villagers had gathered in a wide circle around the platform, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their bodies motionless. The elder raised his staff, and the runes across the platform lit up brighter, spreading light like fire across the stone. David's instinct screamed at him to run, but where would he go? The forest outside felt alive with hidden eyes, and the village itself seemed to hold him trapped. The child whispered again, a soft word he could not understand, but it calmed his racing thoughts for a moment. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The elder spoke in his deep voice, and though David could not understand the words, the meaning pressed against his mind. Images filled his head again, flashes of warriors, of flames, of trials written in blood and stone. He gasped, gripping his head, but the images faded as quickly as they came. The elder struck the staff against the stone, and the runes flared to life. The air around David shimmered, and suddenly the platform was no longer stone. It was something else. He blinked, and the village was gone. He now stood in a dark chamber lit by floating crystals, the child no longer in his arms. Where are you?" he shouted, his voice echoing against the unseen walls. The child's voice echoed faintly in the distance, but he could not see it. The chamber shifted, the walls moving as if alive, and shapes formed from the shadows. A beast emerged, tall and twisted, its body covered with scales, its mouth filled with jagged teeth. It roared, shaking the chamber, and lunged at him. David raised his arm in defense, but there was no weapon in his hands. Fear gripped him, but he remembered the child's trembling hand, the trust it had shown him. He clenched his fists and stood firm, dodging as the beast's claws struck the ground beside him. The chamber echoed with more whispers, voices judging him, watching him. The beast struck again, and David rolled aside, grabbing a shard of crystal from the ground. It cut into his hand, sharp and burning, but he held it tight. When the beast lunged once more, he drove the shard into its neck. The creature screamed, dissolving in a smoke that curled away into the shadows. David gasped, sweat pouring down his face, his hand bleeding. But before he could rest, the chamber shifted again. Now he stood before a puzzle. Stones carved with glowing runes floated in the air, moving in strange patterns. A voice echoed in his head, not words but feelings, balance, wisdom, choice. He stared at the runes, trying to understand. Slowly, he moved one stone closer to another. The glow flickered. The wrong choice made the chamber shake violently, cracks forming in the floor. David closed his eyes, breathing slowly. He thought of the child, of how fragile it looked yet how strong its spirit felt. He moved the stones again, this time aligning them with the glowing marks on his bleeding hand. The chamber calmed, the cracks sealed, the puzzle completed. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 unseen voices chanting. David turned, and there was the child again, standing in the distance, its eyes glowing brighter. He rushed forward, but between them rose a final figure. It was not a beast, not a puzzle, but a warrior, tall and armored in glowing plates. The warrior raised a blade of light, its face hidden by a mask. David's heart pounded. He had no weapon, no armor, only himself. The warrior struck first, its blade slicing through the air with deadly speed. David ducked, barely avoiding it. He grabbed another shard of crystal, but when he swung it, the warrior caught it effortlessly and shattered it in his grip. The warrior's voice echoed through the chamber, though no lips moved. "You cannot lead with strength alone," it whispered into his mind. David froze, panting. The child appeared beside him now, its small hand reaching for his. He looked at it, then at the warrior. Slowly, he lowered his arms, refusing to fight. Instead, he placed himself in front of the child, shielding it, even though he knew the warrior's blade could strike him down in a second. The warrior stopped, silent. The blade lowered, and the mask tilted as though studying him. Then, slowly, the figure stepped back and dissolved into light. The chamber melted away, and the village returned. David was once more standing on the stone platform, the child in his arms, the elder and villagers staring in silence. The elder struck his staff against the stone again, and the runes faded. The trial was over. The villagers bowed their heads, whispering words David still could not understand. But deep inside, he knew one thing. The test had been real, and somehow he had passed. Though he had no idea what it meant, he felt the weight of their eyes on him, not as a stranger anymore. The silence in the village was heavy after the trial. David still held the child close, his heart racing from what he had faced inside the glowing chamber. The villagers whispered among themselves, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their expressions strange, a mix of fear, hope, and something like expectation. He wanted answers, but no one stepped forward to explain. The elder raised his staff again, and the drums returned, deep and slow, echoing through the ground. This time, however, the sound was joined by horns, long and mournful, calling across the village like the cry of a lost world. From the far side of the circle, warriors stepped forward, their armor made of crystal and bone, their faces painted with glowing lines. Each one carried a weapon, blades curved like crescent moons, spears tipped with fire, shields etched with strange runes. David felt his stomach tighten. The elder pointed at him with his staff, then at the warriors. The meaning was clear. The trial was not finished. This was another test. He would have to prove his worth. David shook his head slowly, his voice tense. "I'm not here to fight," he said, though the villagers could not understand his words. The alien child looked up at him, whispering softly, as if urging him to stay strong. He felt its small hand grip tighter against his chest, and something inside him refused to step back. The first warrior stepped onto the platform, his spear glowing faintly in the light. He struck the ground once, and sparks burst into the air. David raised his hands, showing he carried no weapon, no shield. The warrior lunged, his movements fast and precise. David dodged, barely avoiding the strike, his breath sharp in his throat. He stumbled, grabbing a fallen piece of stone from the ground. The warrior came again, spear flashing. David used the stone to block, the impact rattling through his bones. The crowd gasped, some leaning forward with anticipation. It was not strength alone that kept David standing. It was will, the refusal to give in. The elder's staff glowed brighter, and another warrior stepped forward, this one with twin blades. The fight grew harder, strikes raining from every side. David used the broken stone, his fists, even his body, to shield himself and the child. He was cut, bruised, his arms heavy, but he never let the child fall. Each time he stood back up, the whispers of the villagers grew louder. The final warrior came, taller and stronger than the others, his shield covered in runes that burned with fire. He raised his weapon high, his presence filling the platform with crushing weight. David staggered, exhausted, yet when the warrior's blade came down, he threw himself forward, not to strike but to protect. The child's small body was shielded by his own, his back taking the force of the blow. The weapon stopped an inch above him, frozen in the air. The runes on the warrior's shield dimmed, and slowly, the warrior lowered his blade. The crowd fell silent, their whispers vanishing into complete stillness. The warriors stepped back, bowing their heads slightly, their weapons lowered. David blinked in shock, his body trembling, unsure if it was truly over. The elder raised his staff high, his voice carrying across the village. Though David could not understand the words, he felt the meaning press against his heart. This was not a trial of strength. It was a trial of worth. And by protecting the child again and again, by refusing to fight with cruelty, he had shown what they sought. The villagers bowed their heads, some even kneeling in the dust. David stood in the center of the platform, his chest heaving, sweat and blood running down his skin. The child clung to him tighter than ever, its glowing eyes fixed on his face. He looked down at it, confused, exhausted, but also strangely connected. He had passed something greater than he understood. Yet as the silence settled, he noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. A shadowy figure stood apart, taller than the others, armored differently, its gaze sharp and hostile. Unlike the villagers who bowed, this figure did not kneel. Instead, it stepped back into the darkness, its eyes burning with challenge. David shivered, realizing the trials were not finished, and someone in the village did not accept him. The village was still echoing with whispers after David's trial of worth. The warriors had stepped back, their heads bowed, their weapons lowered. The child still clung to him, glowing eyes fixed on his face. To the villagers, it was clear he had proven himself, but in the shadows, not everyone agreed. From the edge of the circle, the tall, armored figure stepped forward. Unlike the others, he did not bow. He did not lower his head. His armor was black crystal, sharp and jagged, his mask carved like the face of a predator. The runes across his chest glowed red instead of blue, a color that made the crowd shift uneasily. Whispers rose again, sharper now, filled with fear. The elder raised his staff, trying to calm the village, but the figure spoke first. His voice cut through the air like steel. Though David could not understand the words, he understood the tone. It was defiance, challenge, rage. The villagers stepped back, leaving space as the rival walked onto the platform, his heavy footsteps shaking the stone. The child trembled against David's chest, whispering softly, a sound filled with fear. David glanced down, tightening his hold. "It's all right," he murmured, though his own heart was heavy. The elder spoke quickly, his voice rising, but the rival only raised his weapon, a blade carved from dark stone that glowed with red fire. The meaning was clear. This was no simple test. This was a duel. David's chest tightened. He had no weapon, no armor, nothing but his will. The rival struck the ground with his blade, sparks flying into the air. The villagers gasped, many turning their faces away. It was as though they already knew what would come. The rival lunged, his blade cutting through the air with deadly speed. David rolled aside, barely avoiding it, the heat of the strike burning across his skin. He stumbled, grabbing a piece of broken stone, but the rival shattered it with a single blow. The force knocked David to his knees, the child crying out softly in his arms. The rival pressed forward, his strikes heavy and merciless. David dodged, blocked with his arms, his body aching with every movement. He had fought before, against hunger, against the wild, against fear itself. But this was different. This was no beast, no puzzle, no faceless warrior. This was someone who wanted to see him broken. The elder shouted again, his staff glowing brighter, but the rival ignored him. His blade came down hard, and David barely moved in time, the strike carving deep into the stone platform. Dust and sparks rose around them, the crowd holding its breath. David staggered back, clutching the child close, his lungs burning. "Why are you doing this?" he muttered, though no one could understand. The rival advanced again, eyes burning behind a mask. David could see it now. This was not only about him. This was about the child, about the future of the village. If David was chosen, the rival would lose his claim. The rival raised his blade for a final strike. David's mind raced. He could not win with force. He could not fight strength with strength. Instead, he dropped to one knee, shielding the child with his body. He spread his arms wide, exposing himself completely, refusing to strike back. The rival froze, the blade hovering above him. The crowd gasped, voices rising like a wave. The elder's staff flared with blinding light, and a shockwave rippled through the platform. The rival staggered, his blade shattering into dust. He roared in fury, but the light forced him back, pushing him to the edge of the circle. The villagers fell to their knees, bowing low. David remained kneeling, his arms still wrapped around the child. The elder stepped forward, his eyes heavy with meaning. The villagers whispered a single word again and again. Though David did not understand it, he felt the weight of it pressing against his heart. The word was not for the rival, not for the elder. It was for him. The rival retreated into the shadows, his eyes still burning, his presence like a storm that had not ended. David knew this was not over. The duel had not been about victory or defeat. It had been about choice, about compassion, about refusing to become the very thing he stood against. And though he had not fought to kill, he had won something far greater. But as the rival disappeared into the darkness, David felt a new fear settle in his chest. The villagers saw him as chosen, but the rivals saw him as an enemy. And enemies in this world did not forgive. The rival vanished into the shadows of the village, but the weight of his presence still hung heavy in the air. The villagers knelt in silence, their glowing eyes lowered, the sound of their whispers fading like wind through broken stone. David remained on his knees, holding the child close, his body shaking from exhaustion. He had survived every trial, yet he still did not know why. The elder stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly, his face calm but unreadable. He spoke words in his strange tongue, and though David could not understand, the meaning pressed against his heart like a heavy hand. The villagers echoed the words, their voices rising in a low chant. The child reached up, placing its small hand against David's chest, and the runes on the elder's staff flared brighter. A sudden vision struck him. He saw fire raining from the skies, warriors kneeling in rows, crowns of light resting on heads of those chosen. He saw a throne carved not of stone or metal, but of memory, of trust, of sacrifice. And at the center of it all, he saw himself, standing tall with the alien child by his side. The vision burned into him, so real he could taste the smoke of the fire and feel the weight of the crown pressing against his brow. He gasped, falling back to his hands, sweat dripping down his face. The child leaned closer, whispering a word softly again and again. David did not know the meaning, but he felt it settle deep inside him, like a seed planted in the soil of his soul. He looked up at the elder, shaking his head. "I didn't choose this," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I only wanted to return a child." But the elder's eyes were steady, as if he had heard such words before. He tapped the staff against the stone platform, and the runes stretched outward in a circle of light. The villagers gasped and bowed lower, their hands pressed to their chests, their foreheads touching the ground. The elder raised his staff high, speaking louder now, his voice echoing like thunder. David staggered to his feet, the child still clinging to him. The air shimmered, and once more the world seemed to bend. He stood not in the village, but in a vast hall of stars, endless and eternal. Figures of light stood around him, their forms tall and majestic, their faces hidden. They pointed to him, not with anger, but with expectation. He turned slowly, heart pounding. "Why me?" he whispered, though no answer came. The child reached for his hand, and when their fingers touched, the hall of stars shifted. The light figures bowed their heads, and a voice older than time itself filled the void. "You returned what was lost," it said, not in words, but in meaning, and in doing so, you became more than a wanderer. The hall vanished, and he was back on the platform, the villagers watching in silence. The elder lowered his staff, and his voice softened, as though speaking only to David. Though the language was strange, David felt the truth press against his mind. He had passed not just a test, but an ancient choosing. The child was not only a lost child. It was a symbol, the living key to the heart of the village. And by protecting it, by refusing to abandon it even when his own life was at risk, he had fulfilled their prophecy. The realization hit him hard. He was not simply their guest, not simply their stranger. He was their chosen leader. The crowd lifted their heads slowly, their glowing eyes filled with awe. They whispered his name, not as an outsider, but as something greater. David felt his knees weaken, his chest tight with disbelief. He had come here by accident, a wanderer looking for minerals, and now the weight of an entire people pressed on his shoulders. He looked down at the child, who gazed back at him with calm certainty. It was no longer trembling, no longer afraid. It held his hand firmly, as though it knew this was always his path. The elder raised his staff one last time, and the villagers bowed low again. The rival was gone into the shadows, but David knew he would return. Enemies beyond the village would soon learn of this choice. And though David had been chosen, he wondered if he was ready for what came next. The night was long, filled with whispers, chants, and the slow, fading echo of drums. The villagers had bowed to him. The elder had spoken words older than memory, and the child had chosen to stay in his arms. Yet David could not sleep. He stood at the edge of the glowing village, staring out into the mist of the forest. The shadows between the trees moved like living things, and in his heart, he knew the rival still lingered. The child rested against his chest, breathing softly, glowing faintly like a lantern in the dark. It no longer trembled, no longer hid its face. Instead, it looked calm, almost proud, as if it understood what David had become before he did. He brushed its silver hair gently, whispering, "I don't know if I can do this." The words vanished into the night, carried away by the mist. Behind him, the elder approached slowly, his staff glowing faintly with blue light. He stood beside David in silence for a long time. Then he spoke, his language strange yet heavy with meaning. David did not understand the words, but the tone was clear: comfort, warning, and trust. The elder pointed toward the forest, then toward the stars above. His eyes met David's, steady and certain, and David understood without words. This was only the beginning. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the village stirred. The huts glowed brighter. The runes across the platform pulsed with life, and the people gathered once more. This time, they did not come in silence. They came with gifts, shards of crystal, pieces of armor, food wrapped in glowing leaves. Each villager placed their offering at David's feet, bowing low, their voices rising in soft chants. David stood uncertain, the child still in his arms. He wanted to tell them he was not a leader, not chosen, not ready. But their eyes told him otherwise. They no longer saw him as a stranger, but as the one who had returned what was lost, the one who had passed the ancient test, the one who had stood against the rival without fear. The elder lifted his staff high, and the villagers knelt as one. David looked down at the child, who smiled faintly, placing its hand against his chest again. The warmth spread through him once more, steady and calm. And though doubt still pressed against his heart, another feeling grew stronger: responsibility. He could not turn away now, not after what he had seen, not after what they had given him. But even as the chants rose higher, the rival's shadow lingered in his mind. He knew the dark warrior would return, stronger, angrier, unwilling to accept a human as their leader. And beyond the village, in the endless forest and the stars above, greater enemies waited. The vision of fire and war returned to him, clearer now. This was not only about the child, not only about the village. This was about something larger, something that stretched far beyond this world. The elder's voice rang out, final and powerful. The villagers echoed, their chant carrying across the forest. David stood at the center, the child by his side, his heart pounding as the weight of their belief settled on him. He raised his hand slowly, not knowing why, but the crowd roared with voices, their chants becoming a song. It was as if the village itself breathed life into him, declaring him not a visitor, but their chosen. The sun rose higher, and light poured across the glowing huts, across the kneeling villagers, across the platform where David stood. He was no longer the wanderer who had come searching for minerals. He was the man who had carried a lost child, who had faced trials of beasts, puzzles, and warriors, who had defied a rival not with cruelty, but with compassion. And now he was the leader they had been waiting for. David looked at the child one last time, and the child nodded softly, its glowing eyes calm and sure. For the first time, David did not feel only fear. He felt purpose. But far away, in the shifting shadows of the forest, the rival watched, his eyes burning, his voice whispering promises of war. The new dawn had begun, but it carried with it the shadow of battles yet to come.